Can I just say one thing?
Sure.
I hope it's okay, but outside my place, they're doing works on our national broadband network, and I have had problems with some of the reception. And I think if we just persevere through that, and I imagine you can edit any problems out.
Hi, this is Tucker Goodrich. I am here with my co-host, Brian Curley, and today we have the honor to be joined by Professor Anthony Hulbert, who is joining us from Australia. He's Professor Emeritus of Wollongong University. Am I getting that right?
Exactly. Wollongong, yeah.
Excellent. And where he had a long and illustrious career as a zoophysiologist, emeritus of Wollongong University. Am I getting that right?
Exactly. Wollongong, yeah.
Excellent. And where he had a long and illustrious career as a zoophysiologist. Am I saying that correctly? So he's...
Yes, a zoologist, but interested in how animals work. So, yeah, a zoophysiologist. Our
Okay.
pronunciation, American Australian, will probably differ, but everything's fine.
Two countries divided by a common language.
Yes.
And you started in zoology in 1969. You completed your Bachelor of Science degree, and then you got a Doctor of Philosophy in Zoology in 1973. And then you spent most of your career after a little bit of time over here in the United States at Cornell. Was that where you met? No, you wouldn't have met Tom Brenna at Cornell. He was probably after you. And Tom Brenna, who we interviewed in episode 5, was kind enough to make this introduction to us. And then you moved on to Wollongong and spent the bulk of your career there.
I have spent quite a lot of time in the US, probably about 5 years in total, in various study leaves. So I've been at University of California at Irvine, Stanford University, Columbia in New York, and Texas, San Antonio, and also connected with the Buck Institute. So I know I've had quite a broad experience with the US and very diverse regions of it.
Excellent. Good to hear. Or my condolences, whatever's more appropriate. What got you interested in zoology? Why that particular field?
I had a good lecturer in third year, undergraduate, who gave a course in animal physiology, and I started to learn things about animals, which blew my mind. As I say in the preface to the book, the first one was that the breath a bird takes doesn't come out in the next exhalation, comes out 2 exhalations later. And those sorts of things. And for instance, why don't seals and whales get the bends? They take air breaths at the surface, go down deep, come up. And those sorts of things, I became fascinated essentially in how animals work. And that's how I started. This lecturer was a young lecturer. He'd just come back from doing a postdoc himself in the States. And out of flattery, I think he encouraged me, or flattered to me, he encouraged me to do an honours project on a metabolic rate in marsupials. And that was the beginning of my path through that. So I've come to this area from a different angle than many people. Many people have come through disease and nutrition. I've come up through trying to understand cells and how they work, and come up through the cell membrane perspective. And so I think that's been an advantage in some ways.
I was just going to say, I think that's a big advantage because first off, my understanding of your research is that you've been looking at animals across species. You haven't been just looking at mammals. You've written papers comparing mammals to birds and, trying to get down to some common denominators. One of, I think, your most interesting papers, well, series of papers, really, to be fair, is your membrane pacemaker idea. Could you give us a little bit of background to that. That's, by the way, how I came across your work prior to being introduced to you by Tom Brenna. I had been doing some research into, the role of omega-6 and omega-3 fats in blindness, various types of blindness, and came across a paper describing the declining quantity of polyunsaturated fats in the corneal lens based on the longevity of different species, something that really blew my mind. And he mentioned your membrane pacemaker paper as being kind of a seminal start to that line of research. Can you explain that to us a little bit?
Yeah, so in the metabolism area, I became aware that warm-blooded mammals have a metabolic rate, or a resting metabolic rate, so they're not even working, they're just maintaining the living state, about many times, 5 times the amount of a reptile or an amphibian, cold-blooded. And so I used this comparison to try and understand what was it about a mammal that required them at rest. So it's like the fuel consumption of a car when it's idling. It was having to use so much energy. And we found that a lot of the energy is being used in maintaining the inside of the cell different from the outside of the cell. And that's a key aspect of life that many people don't realize, especially excluding sodium ions.
Right.
So,
which must go back to the origin of life in a hot vent somewhere under the ocean, where
that's right.
These sodium pumps must have been one of the first innovations to allow life to exist.
It's bags of potassium in a sea of salt.
That's right. And in fact, most people wouldn't realize that almost all vertebrates, freshwater fish, saltwater fish, reptiles, amphibians, birds, mammals, their body fluids are about 1/3 the concentration of seawater, which is probably, I imagine, the concentration of the environment when these systems started to evolve. So anyway, we found that mammals were using, so about half the amount of energy that an animal uses is to maintain these ion gradients. And so we found that mammals were spending a lot more energy on these sodium pumps. And we found that they didn't have more sodium pumps, that the sodium pump in a mammal cell was operating at about 7,000 cycles per minute, revs per minute, and about 2,000 in a cold-blooded animal cell. So the mammal cell is like keeping a boat afloat by using a bilge pump. You're rapidly having to get rid of the sodium that's leaking into the cell. We found out that and we kept on chasing, well, why is this? Why is the pump working faster? And a key experiment in our thinking was we thought the membrane around the sodium pump was very important. And so we did a series of experiments where we took we were using a rat and a toad comparison at that time, and we took a rat pump and we put it in a toad membrane, and we took a toad pump and put it in a rat membrane. That's roughly describing. And sure enough, the rat pump, when in a toad membrane, operated at the toad activity and vice versa. So that's a series of what we call species crossover experiments. And we did it later also.
So it didn't have anything to do with the pump. It was entirely the context of the pump.
Entirely the membrane around the pump.
Right.
So many people, and we tend to concentrate on chemistry when we look at molecules. We look at the way atoms are taken off and new ones are put on. We tend to ignore physics of the molecule. So most people wouldn't be aware, because drawing of a membrane is a very static thing, that these membrane fats are moving very rapidly around the membrane. So an individual membrane fat can travel right around a red blood cell within a second, roughly. And in the book, the hardest chapter was trying to write that chapter about membranes and biochemistry. And I know most readers find that very difficult, or the most difficult part of the book. But it's a critical aspect, I think, of the difference between omega-3 and omega-6, which are the important fats, fatty acids in the membrane.
Right. But yeah, I mean, I agree. It was a critical chapter because it makes the reader understand that we're talking about a fundamental process here. And metabolic rate, we'll have to get back to that because there's been some interesting recent research done on that topic in humans. By a gentleman I believe, John Speakman.
Oh, yes, I do.
Anyway, so that's all right. So that establishes that, as I recall from reading that chapter, that essentially please correct me if I'm saying this wrong, and I'm sure I am. It's essentially the Brownian motion of these molecules, the heat energy that's driving the pumps. It's running off heat energy, essentially. So
Brownian motion is what we think about it, but of course these molecules are colliding with each other.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, I like to use the description of they tend to vibrate. And that's what temperature is. Temperature is just a measure of the movement and the vibrations of individual molecules. You know, a molecule doesn't move only absolute zero, minus 273 degrees Celsius, you know, this is, you know, when we talk about temperature, we're talking about the movement of molecules, and the movement of molecules colliding with each other and moving, and therefore moving within each other. When we draw a picture of a molecule, it's quite an artifice. You know, when we draw a diagram of what a molecule looks like, it's quite an artifice. You'll see, for instance, some people that are drawing the membranes will draw it as a straight line. Other people that are interested in how that molecule interacts will draw it as a curve, you know.
Right.
You know, and so we need to be aware that we can't see this, but we know it's occurring. You know, that, and that's to me an important, little appreciated aspect of these molecules, and especially fatty acids.
So now what would happen, say, if you replaced all the fats in this membrane with saturated fats?
Well, the membrane would be solid. So saturated fats, the sorts of things that are in, you know, the 18 carbon, 16 carbon long fatty acids, have a melting point of about 50 degrees Celsius, roughly. So at temperatures below 50 degrees Celsius, you know, they're solid.
You get a bar of soap.
Exactly. And so that's the fundamental reason. The other thing is, having an evolutionary perspective, I sort of ask simple questions like, why do monounsaturates, why do polyunsaturates exist? We tend to just accept these things. The reason, in my view, why they exist is that the early forms of life, the bacteria, for want of a better word, would have been fine in thermal hot springs. The membranes only containing saturated fatty acids would have been solid, but as soon as the temperatures dropped in their environment, they wouldn't have been able to cope, because membranes need to be in this relatively fluid state. And so that's why saturates were evolved.
So the saturates at, say, room temperature or body temperature wouldn't be able to drive the sodium pumps.
That's right. Yeah, they wouldn't, and lots of other things that are happening in membranes, all the other proteins and lots of processes wouldn't work. And so that's why, so bacteria, for instance, have mixtures of saturates and monounsaturates. And if you put, this is with E. coli, the common bacteria in the intestines of humans, if you put that in a cold temperature, within 30 seconds, at the earliest period that they've measured, it's taken some of the saturates out of the membranes and put monounsaturates in their place to maintain the same fluidity, viscosity of the membrane. It's a very old, important process that
highly conserved across species, of course.
Yeah, so it was first described in the E. coli and bacteria, but we now know it to occur in plants and animals, and especially a lot of work was done in the 80s on fish, especially cold water fish. It's called homeoviscous, constant viscosity, of cell membranes. So in other words, maintaining that fluid state of cell membranes.
And this is the reason why colder temperature fish tend to have more polyunsaturated fat in their body.
Exactly. There was a great scientist, Jeff Hazel, I think he's still alive, but he worked on fish, and so the fish, and especially adaptation to cold temperatures, and he showed that fish also changed the polyunsaturated content. And one little comment he made, he said he can't understand why they're increasing the polyunsaturated content, because they could maintain fluid membranes just by changing the monounsaturated content as the bacteria do. And that was a crucial sentence in one of his papers that made me think about what are the polyunsaturates doing. And they're doing something extra than just maintaining membrane fluidity. They're actually moving within the membrane and causing the other participants in the membrane to also move. I mean, chemical processes, it's essentially that vibration which is causing these things to operate quickly.
Interesting. It's a fascinating part of the story. I'd never heard this from anybody else described in that way. And it really helps one understand. I mean, in the online environment that Brian and I operate in, I often hear people say, well, you should just replace everything with saturated fats. They're the stable fats. And okay, gets into another topic, another part of your book. But yeah, I think it's helpful to understand that these fats are necessary at such a fundamental level for life to operate.
Exactly.
So you did, I think it was a paper, first author was Abbott in 2012, where you looked at the diet and the fatty acid composition in the body. And you found something that surprised me, and I think I'm speaking for Brian here, that surprised the both of us, regarding how the body handles variations in dietary fats. You took, what was it, a passel of mice and fed them, 12 different diets with wide variations across the fatty acids that were in these diets. And what did you discover?
So coming to that, so I've described how membranes change, but actually they're also regulated. This fluidity, this viscosity, words are never perfect, is maintained. I've been asked to write a review along with colleagues, and found out that actually the normal, most of the scientific papers had looked at unusual situations. They compared two diets, and the normal situation really wasn't understood. So we decided to try and vary fatty acid composition of the diet and follow what was happening in storage lipids and membrane lipids. So most people don't think of membranes, but membranes are the skin around cells. And they're regulated. And so what we found was that, I don't know how best to explain this, but we fed rats a complete diet, everything else, except varied the type of fats. And we only concentrated on 18 carbon fats. I don't know whether people will understand what I'm talking about there, because
which are the most common fats in the diet. Things like oleic acid in olive oil, and linoleic acid in seed oils, and stearic acid in beef fat.
Yeah, so they're the common ones, but they're actually not the common ones necessarily in membranes. And unfortunately, a lot of the work on humans, you can't get to the membrane level easily. And because even red blood cells, for instance, are unusual cells. They don't have a nucleus. And so most of the work needs to be done on rats or mice.
Well, human subjects tend to object when you want to homogenize their brain to figure out the fatty acid composition.
Yeah, well, and yes, they do. I agree with that. What we've found is that although the polyunsaturates were kept constant, the monounsaturates were kept constant totally, that there was especially a difference between the two types of polyunsaturates, omega-3 and omega-6. Most people have heard of omega-3, very few people have heard of omega-6.
Right. So regardless of what fatty acid composition you fed them in the diet of saturated, monounsaturated, and polyunsaturated, the membranes look the same.
As far as total polyunsaturates went. But,
right.
But a key finding was that the cells can't differentiate very well between omega-3 and omega-6. And in fact, I don't like using the word polyunsaturates anymore. I tend to use omega-3 and omega-6 because they're two very different classes of fats.
Amen.
Yeah.
Yeah, amen.
And most people
point out in your book, there are way too many papers that just say, oh, polyunsaturates or PUFAs, and it's very frustrating when you realize they're largely missing the point often on what they're the topic they're covering.
Yes, and in fact, it's still a problem, and it's only these polyunsaturates that are essential in the diet. Higher animals can't make them, and therefore they have to get have to be obtained in the diet. But saturates and monounsaturates they can make. You can feed an animal a fat-free diet, absolutely no fat, and it can make lots of saturates and monounsaturates, but it can't make the omega-3 and omega-6. And those are a key perspective, and they're very different types of fats. It was only in recent years that it was appreciated that there were different types of fats, but they're still referred to as polyunsaturates. I wish we didn't use those words. I wish we used omega-3 and omega-6 rather than and differentiate between them. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I think Brian and I both agree with you on that. So the three broad classes of fats stayed roughly the same, but the omega-6s and the omega-3s pretty closely followed the diet. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, because you higher animals. When I say this, it's always higher animals, so vertebrates. Actually, even insects, but some very lower animals can make omega-3s and omega-6s, but higher animals you have to get them already made in the diet, and you can't interconvert them. You know, so there are two types of essential fatty acids, omega-3 and omega-6, and the food chain has and this has only really been we've only become aware of that quite recently, it's only about 20 years, but a bit more than that, sorry, about probably 30 years ago. It's most people aren't aware of that. They're aware of omega-3s, but most people have never heard of omega-6s.
Well, we've been working to change that. We've had some success.
Yeah, there's still a lot of way to go though.
Yes, that's very true.
So that study where you did all the different relative concentrations of omega-6 and omega-3, you found that
and saturated and monounsaturated. He was varying everything, which was a key part of the key finding in the experiment. So
you found that the relative amount of PUFA was consistent, but to zero in on the idea that we have in the book to get started here is can you explain how that within that PUFA, how the 6 and 3, the consistency that you saw there, or the range of consistency?
Yeah, so the two omega-6s and omega-3s are the two types of polyunsaturates, and the balance in the diet determined the balance between them determined their balance in membranes, and more specifically, in the diet that we used an 18 carbon omega-3 and an 18 carbon omega-6 because that's what we eat. but there's very little 18 carbons omega-3 and omega-6 in membranes. They're mainly 20, 22 carbons. And a key finding was this one called arachidonic acid, which is from what a lot of cell messengers are made, inflammation mediators and all that, was how's the way to describe it in a non-biochemical way, was very increased and showed the greatest variation in membranes, and that was determined by the balance between omega-3s and omega-6s in the diet. And that was very tight. This 20 carbon, 4 double bonds, arachidonic acid is a very important fatty acid in membranes. It's what lots of things are made from, but it's very little in the diet, and it's mainly made from an 18 carbon omega-6. And what we found is it wasn't the amount of omega-6 in the diet that determined the amount of this arachidonic acid, is the other name for it, but it was the balance between the omega-6s and omega-3s which determined it. Quite an important aspect. And that's, in the book, I've concentrated on the balance between these two fatty acids. You need to look at them in combination and what the balance is, rather than look at omega-3 and omega-6 separately. It just doesn't work if you do it separately.
Yeah, you do an excellent job of getting that point across.
Yeah.
Is there a number that you could cite right now? I don't remember off the top of my head of what that relative PUFA is in membranes, and is that something that you see across an organism, or is it like specific to certain tissue types, or what? How could you further describe that for folks?
The most important tissue, the one that shows the least variation, is the brain. It's very tightly regulated, and even though diet varies, so it concentrates on omega-3. Omega-3 tend to speed up membrane processes. Omega-6 will speed them up, but not as much as omega-3. And the omega-6, 20 carbon omega-6 is the one that most of the inflammation mediators are all made from. And it's sort of most influenced by the balance between omega-3 and omega-6 in the diet. That's why the book was called Omega Balance, as sort of to try and get across that concept. And
right.
So, yeah.
So how did you move? So the book is mostly about human health. I mean, it's a fascinating, yes. This is important to understand, I think, to set the stage, but the book is really about human health. How did you, a zoologist, get interested in moving this topic from your experiments and your explorations in the animal kingdom into how it could apply to human health?
I came through this area to look at cell membranes. Most of the people that look at fats look at storage of energy, and I realized that the skin around each cell, which is made up of these fats, determines the activity of processes that are happening in the cell membrane. And I became aware of that back in the 1980s, 1990s, and that's been my area of research. And I was expecting that to become more widely known in the literature, and it slowly wasn't. It was making me frustrated. So in 2008, I stopped teaching. I went into a research-only phase as an academic, and I decided to try and start writing a book about it. And I went to the US and spent some time. I find if I'm writing, I have to be obsessive. That's the only thing that I can work on. I came back for various reasons. I had other commitments at work. And then eventually, in about 2018, I decided, this wasn't being made aware of, and that I needed to write this book. So then I sat down for a number of years. COVID came. I had trouble. I tried to write it so it's readable by a general public as well as by a scientist. It's not an easy thing to do.
I think you succeeded.
Yeah, great job.
Yeah. And set off, it was a good, editor who encouraged me, and he told me I had to cut it down in size to about half, and that was good also. I'm really glad I had that process. And then so eventually the book Omega Balance came about. I think you're just interested in human health. I became aware of omega 3s and then omega 6s. I only realized in writing the book that most people have never heard of omega 6s, even though they're. And I also became aware that the human food chain had changed quite dramatically. Originally, I was only going to, my area that I came into this is through metabolism. I was only going to write about certain aspects, but the more I read, the more important it seemed to me became, and I realized I had to bring myself up to scratch to be able to write about lots of all mental health issues. So the basic story is that our diet used to be more balanced between omega 3s and 6s,
yes,
and it's now become dominated by omega 6s, and omega 6s are the drivers of inflammation and various other things, such that in the past it was probably about 50-50, maybe 40-60 omega 3, omega 6. Nowadays, the average diet is, or the average for the US and for Australia is about 9 to 10% omega 3, 89 to 90% omega 6, and I think that this is a major health consequence for all sorts of diseases. All these current epidemics that we call them are really related to the food chain, and that's the average for the country, mind you. There'll be people that'll be
much worse,
much less than that, and it's become a major, I think, a major problem, and it's sort of related to the fact also, I think it's an advantage being a biologist, a zoologist. So I went back through the food chain. So as soon as people hear of omega 3, they think fish oils.
Fish oil, right.
And what they don't realize is that back in the 1960s, it was shown that no, fish don't make omega 3s. They have to get it through the diet. And omega 3s and omega 6s come from plants. And a fundamental difference between is they come from different parts of the plant. So omega 6s come from seeds and omega 3 come from leaves. The reason why marine food is high in omega 3 is because all the plants in the marine system are essentially leaves. Marine plants don't make seeds. It's terrestrial plants that make seeds.
Right.
And we may call them grain, whatever. But also we've shifted over to to producing huge amounts of seeds, grains, and that's been a dominant feature in the Western diet, and increasingly more and more in other countries' diets also. So,
and as you mentioned in the book, we've shifted the animals that should be eating leaves and getting a lot of omega 3s over to eating more greens and getting more omega 6s.
Yes,
which is a really great point to make.
Yes, well, and and this has been done before we're even aware that omega 3s and omega 6s were a very different group of fatty acids and have quite different effects.
Right.
So,
do you have, just my own curiosity, do you have any idea why plants are organizing their fats that way? Why they're putting the omega 6s into the seeds?
No, I don't know. Omega 3 seem to be very important in photosynthesis, but I don't think we really understand exactly why.
Yeah, to summarize for folks listening, the groundwork that you have put out there is that the individual units of organisms, the cells for folks that are listening, the envelope, the actual surrounding membrane, how cells even communicate with each other, how they collect to make your brain and make every part of your body, that the polyunsaturated fat is a consistent percentage that is needed for these things to work. And in that percentage, the relative amount of omega-6 and omega-3 is controlled by everything that you put in your mouth, as in like you said, the whole diet approach. So from
Yeah,
the beginning of the
that's
day
a
to
great
the
part
end
of the book.
day. Yeah, so everything that you eat, and it's not just the types of fats that you're eating, but also the membranes of the leaves that you're eating and the membranes of everything that you're eating. They all come into play. And you're saying that that there's grave consequences to how much omega-6 to how much omega-3 to that
I don't know whether you can hear me, but our connection is starting to break up.
It's all right. I said I just wanted to narratively carry people through like the point, that we're making here, because what we're positing is, why this balance is important. And then getting to what I love about his book is he carries people through what is normal and why, and which is fascinating how he talks about what heavy carbon and heavy nitrogen and the difference of photosynthesis, where he says, look, you can dig up, a Stone Age man and figure out how much meat to, leaves to seeds that he ate.
Right.
You could say this is how we know this is normal, because that's the argument. What's normal, right? And he goes into that in this book. So being like that's a great.
Can you hear me?
You're back.
So we were summarizing for the folks listening how each individual, you've discovered in your research that each individual cell regulates the.
Yeah. Okay. Go ahead.
So in your research, you discovered that each individual cell regulates the percentage of PUFA relative to the saturated fat and monounsaturated fat.
Right.
And intriguingly, within that percentage of PUFA that's fixed, that the relative omega-6 to omega-3 reflects whole diet, everything that you put in your mouth, from the membranes of the leaves that you eat to the meat and the muscle meat or anything. It all it reflects in there, and that there's consequences to how much omega-6 to omega-3, and the way you described omega balance being the percentage of 3 compared to the entire one.
To the entire content of PUFA.
And to carry a bridge here, which is fascinating in the book, is that we've got beautiful chemical knowledge of what people used to eat, and you could determine how that balance, that omega-3 balance, used to be a lot higher. There was a lot more omega-3 in our diet relative to omega-6, and that's changed significantly with the Western diet, or the down under diet, the industrialized diet, whereas it used to be, even as high as 60-70%, or some cultures with dominated by fish even higher. But it's the inverse now, where like you were saying, as low as 9% omega-3 to total PUFA, or even lower depending on folks.
Exactly. 9% would be the average for the whole of the US. So some people are extremely low. So yeah, and it seems to me there are 4 changes that have happened that have changed this balance. Both the relative amount of omega-3 is diminished, and the relative amount of omega-6 is increased, but it's been the absolute increase. So there's been grain feeding. So the first thing, I suppose, is that both of them come from plants predominantly. Omega-3 come from leaves, and omega-6s come from seeds. In fact, the original title of the book wasn't Omega Balance. I sent it in as Meats, Seeds and Leaves. And the publisher changed it to Omega Balance, which I'm quite happy with.
I think that I like I like your original title, but I think Omega Balance has more impact.
Works, and so the other title will be used later, I hope. So what was I saying? So there have been 4 main trends that have occurred. Is that we've shifted. So it used to be balanced, but nowadays we grow a huge amount of seeds. We call them grain, and we make seeds oil. And vegetable oils have become a dominant substitute for animal fats. And what's more, we're feeding animals, especially pigs, chicken, and cattle, grain We're feeding them seeds. We're giving them an omega-6 diet where they used to eat leaves, which was an omega-3 diet. The other is that we're taking, used to be that we got a lot of our omega-3s through dairy products. And dairy now, especially in the US, has shifted to grain being fed, and so dairy has become imbalanced. And also we've taken the fat out of dairy. You know, this obsession with fat reduced dairy is quite mind-boggling. And there was,
and I mean, your experiment with the rats makes me think that trying to take the saturated fat out of the diet, and especially when you're replacing it with carbohydrates, is just pointless, because your body's just going to create carbohydrates from, or saturated fats from, the carbohydrates that you're eating. And
right.
The amount of saturated fat in your fat tissue may go down, but it's not going to make a difference to the rest of your body.
Right. So these are the lessons of nutrition. It's the polyunsaturates. It's these two types of polyunsaturates, omega-3 and omega-6, which used to be balanced and now have become very imbalanced, especially in the modern food chain. And they've been imbalanced for quite a long while in the US, increasingly in Australia, you know, and in other parts of the world.
Now, you go through a number of examples in the book of the impact this is having on human health. Pick one, pick what you think is the most significant one, and explain the evidence for this actually having an impact on human health. Because that's clearly, you know, we've discussed the seeds and the leaves. This is really the meat of the book.
Well, it's my area initially. I was going to concentrate on just obesity and metabolism. Actually, the most important thing, I think, which is not appreciated, is the mental aspects of all this. The mental health, that was the real revelation to me. And the fact that our bodies, our cells, don't seem to be able to tell the difference between omega-3 and omega-6. So it's the balance between them that's in the diet that determines the balance in the membranes. And the cell membranes are the important aspects. So most of the book is connected with the health consequences, and I had to, although my background is as a zoologist, you know, I concentrated mainly on the human consequences of it, or what we know, and so obesity is one. We go back to the 1950s. There's a guy called Ansel Keys. I don't know if
We've heard of him.
Yes.
Another zoologist, we should note.
Exactly. It was interesting to find out he was a zoologist, and quite a good zoologist too. Sort of. But
And a fellow who also moved on to human health.
Yes, he moved on to human health very early in his postdoc, and he was obviously a very dominant personality, and he used to essentially intimidate other scientists, I think, is the best word. Towards the end of his life, apparently he expressed very quietly some regret about his earlier attitudes towards people, but he was the one that, first of all, picked on fat in the diet, and it was total fat in the diet. And then he later on changed it to not to total fat, but to sort of saturated fat and stuff like that. He had to change things.
And he was also the first person to push polyunsaturated fats as a treatment, using them as a drug essentially for heart disease, if I'm correct.
Yes, yeah. But they didn't differentiate between omega-6 and omega-3. They really didn't know the difference. That's only become apparent in the last 30 years or so, the last 30, 40 years, and it's still not really appreciated.
Well, that's a good point to emphasize what you're saying right there, is that when we look back at how things have changed over the last 150 years, the details of it were not known. We should emphasize that for folks listening, that, we didn't know what omega-3 and omega-6 was in 1911. When we're scooping out Crisco and trying something new, we didn't have these details all laid out. This was, people were making these decisions for other reasons, economic reasons and such.
Yeah, I've come across one of the things I try to do is in the scientific literature, is go back and read some of the earlier stuff and use hindsight, use our awareness now to see what they were saying. And I came across this book, I suppose it is, The Newer Knowledge of Nutrition. I don't know if you can see that, written in 1919 by a guy called McCollum. And of course, before this, not much was known, but he comes up. I'm just going to read out a little bit, if it's okay.
Of course.
We're now able to make certain generalizations of fundamental importance regarding the types of natural foodstuffs which may be expected to give good results in the nutrition of an animal. Seed mixtures, no matter how complex or from what seeds they are derived, will never induce optimal nutrition. The only successful combination of natural foods or milk products for the nutrition of an animal are combinations of seeds or other milk products with sufficient amounts of the leaves of plants. In other words, he's sort of saying, the problem is our agriculture has moved towards seeds, exactly.
Even then, he's pointing out that the balance is necessary.
That's beautiful. That's just, that's great to find that line.
And milk and the leaves of plants are to be regarded as protective foods and should never be omitted from the diet. Milk is a better protective food than our leaves when used in appropriate amounts. And that's just to say that, evolution has, resulted in a good nutrition for a young mammal, to be provided milk. So this is well before we even know about saturated fats, monounsaturated omega-3 and omega-6. It's quite an early work, and it's one of the tasks I've set myself of reading these books. I like going back to the earlier literature and using hindsight to interpret, taking their results and using hindsight rather than looking at it. So yeah.
So talk to us a little bit about omega-6 and metabolism and obesity, because that's probably the biggest issue. I mean, we're in the middle of an obesity epidemic. It's a big issue. And that, I think, is one of the ones where everybody, when they walk outside and go to the store or walk down the street, are going to see evidence of a huge change. I mean, anybody who's been alive for any period of time has noticed that people have gotten much fatter over the last couple of decades. To a level that's never been seen in all of human history. How does this omega balance bear on our obesity epidemic?
So in the past, there used to be a reasonable balance between omega-3s and omega-6s. And the modern food chain, so seeds and grains have taken over, and especially vegetable oils have started to come to dominate the food chain, and vegetable oils, for some reason in plants, the seeds are predominantly omega-6, whereas the leaves have predominantly omega-3. And this is, and so vegetable oils, which are essentially just crushed seeds, are hugely dominate omega-6, but also we've started to feed cattle grain, seeds, call them slightly different things.
Right.
And so, rather than what they were evolved to eat, leaves, so omega-6s have come to dominate the food chain, very much so. And even more and more, when you look, I looked at ice cream the other day, so you'd think it's ice cream has come from milk from a cow. It's a dairy product. No, there's vegetable oils, crushed the seeds in many ice creams nowadays, because it's a cheaper form of oil. So that's to me, the dominant thing in the modern food chain is this imbalance between omega-3s and omega-6s, such that omega-6s have come to dominate and just replace omega-3s. And this has had huge consequences, and we're becoming more and more aware of it all the time. So the inflammation mediators are essentially made from omega-6. So all the chronic inflammation that's going on, all the diseases associated with chronic inflammation are due to an imbalance in the modern food chain of omega-6s over omega-3s. And also the brain, so a very important fatty acid in the brain is an omega-3 fatty acid. Its official name is docosahexaenoic acid, 22 carbons long, 6 double bonds, and it's
DHA is how they market it in fish oil.
Yeah, and it's a hugely important and a very strongly regulated aspect of the brain. If you don't, and you can make.
Hi, Tony. Welcome back.
Tony?
I did send you that Speakman paper.
And I've read it and happy to comment about that. So to comment about obesity, and that's where John Speakman's paper comes into it, and he has to be, I know John, and he's probably the guru in doubly labelled water measurements, and I think it's a very significant paper. I hadn't been aware of it, I must admit, until you sent it to me. And the general attitude towards obesity, as I said in the book, is a little bit like a morality tale. Too much gluttony and too much slothfulness, and especially that lack of activity is a common misconception, as John's papers points out. Many people tend to think, oh, well, it's because we're not being active enough.
Right.
And the evidence is just that's not true. I think his title is a little bit misleading. Maybe if I can just describe my feeling towards it. So he's done a fantastic job of collating and collecting a lot of data for what's called total energy expenditure, which they measure by being a person with water molecules in which the hydrogen and the oxygen are labelled. The hydrogen leaves the body only as water. The oxygen leaves the body as water and also carbon dioxide. And by looking at the difference, they can calculate out how much carbon dioxide is being exhaled, which is a measure of metabolic rate. So that's the basic technique. And then he's converted those values into energy terms. He's also collated, so within metabolism, and so that's measuring the total metabolic activity of a person over days and doing all sorts of things. And the area of metabolism is what's called basal energy metabolism, which has got a long history in biology of essentially standardizing conditions to measure metabolic rate. And it's normally measured by measuring oxygen consumption and sometimes also carbon dioxide production.
And just to be clear here for the audience, basal metabolic rate is essentially how much energy you burn, not including activity. So it's your body's basic energy budget. Yeah.
So the history of that is it was used initially before there were sophisticated techniques to measure thyroid hormones. Basal metabolism was used originally to assess whether a person has an overactive thyroid or not. So there were a number of conditions. The first thing was that the person was resting. The second thing is that they were no longer processing food. In other words, they were fasting. They'd been about at least 12 hours since they had their last meal, and so they were metabolizing fat. And the other thing is that they're in what's called a thermoneutral environment. They're not producing heat in response to a cold environment to maintain body temperature. So it's a little bit like measuring the fuel consumption of a car at the traffic lights, where it's just sitting there and the engine's turning over, the human body is turning over, and it's not measuring the fuel consumption of the car when it's traveling. So it's like measuring the idling fuel consumption. It's like a minimum. Sometimes metabolism can go a bit lower, but essentially it's the minimum. And most people wouldn't realize that actually about 2/3 of their daily metabolic rate is, associated with this keeping the body alive, this basal metabolism. In energy terms, it's about the same amount of energy as an 80-watt light globe, in the old-fashioned incandescent light globes.
Yeah, I loved you make that point in your book. I love that. I told my wife she was equivalent to an 80-watt bulb, and she was like, "Oh no, I'm much brighter."
Well, that's the modern globes, the LED globes, are much brighter and they don't use anyway, but I'm using the old incandescent. It turns out a candle is about, a standard candle is apparently about 80 watts also. So to think that the amount of energy being used in burning that standard candle is essentially the same as you use just to maintain living state is, I find, quite remarkable.
Right. So you'd mentioned Speakman's the guru of doubly labeled water to measure metabolism, and he's brilliantly built a database of these results using this method over several decades. And he was doing some sort of analysis, and he discovered that the basal metabolic rate of people around the world has been going down for decades.
Well, there are two things. He's got something like 4,500 measurements of total, energy turnover, and about 1,500 for basal energy metabolism. There are two different data sets which he's put together to try and do it. To me, his major finding is that essentially there's been no change in total energy metabolism, over time. So this concept that we're less active and therefore we're got more fuel storage, more obese, is just not true.
But also beyond that, he found the difference between basal energy and total energy is, of course, activity.
Activity, yeah.
And he found, and as a result, basal's gone down, total stayed the same. Our activity level has actually gone up, which is very counterintuitive.
Well, it's not really, because a lot of people think that obese people have a lower activity energy metabolism. But of course, the problem is, although, for instance, there's one study I cited in the book, although obese people take, say, less steps per day, they have to move a lot more weight, and actually their energy consumption is greater because they've got all this fat tissue that it's much more energy for an obese person to walk up a set of stairs than it takes for a lean person to walk up a set of stairs. The obese person won't be as active during the day, but the total energy consumption of obese people is, as far as activity goes, is actually quite high because they have to use so much energy to move all that extra weight, and that's the counterintuitive aspect. So this,
that's a great point.
So and that's the key finding. And so when you so the title of the paper is Total Energy Expenditure Has Declined Over the Past 3 Decades Due to Declining Basal Expenditure, Not Reduced Activity Expenditure. Actually, when he says total energy expenditure has declined, that's what is called adjusted data. When he looked at the unadjusted data, it hadn't declined, and the adjusted data is a statistical way of looking at data, taking into account that body mass has increased over time, and so when you look at it, actually,
the raw data,
it's the raw data has essentially been the same. And I'd also, this is a pedantic quibble with him, I'd also say that one of the things about total energy expenditure is converting it from carbon dioxide production to energy. The values are whether you're burning carbohydrate or fat. And fat in the food supply has increased over the same period. And in fact, if you, I don't know what value he's used, but I don't think it's been adjusted for the changing metabolism of fat. So actually total energy expenditure has probably gone up, which is counterintuitive. I don't want to get into the sort of semantics.
Sorry, go ahead.
So I think I understand when you want to get a scientific paper published, it's like anything. There's a certain amount of marketing needs to go on. And so the title that total energy expenditure has declined over the past 3 decades is only in the adjusted data, which has been adjusted for the increase in body size and also changing ages of the different samples that were measured. And the key point is to make is that activity hasn't gone down. Activity actually has, if anything, gone up. And the other thing is he's got so many data points that he's fantastic statistics, but there's a difference between statistical significance and physiological significance. So he certainly shows that there's a statistical change, but when you look at the actual level of change, there's been relatively little. And I'd even wonder whether basal energy metabolism has gone down. He's only shown it, for instance, in males, not in females. But anyway, that's a quibble. The real strength of the paper is the amount of data, the sophisticated analysis, which shows that actually slothfulness has not increased over time, or at least as measured in energy consumption terms. And so that's the explanation for the obesity epidemic.
Right. In a couple of the papers he cites, he cites some papers where as we've been discussing, and as you make a great point in the book, the biggest change in the diet has been the increase in PUFA, and
that's right. And omega-6.
And omega-6 specifically. The papers that he cites reference how increasing omega-3 can actually increase metabolic rate, and fine, well enough. And they say, therefore, it's unfair to claim that an increase in PUFA could cause a decline in metabolic rate. But they're looking at omega-3. They're not looking at omega-6 when they say that. I mean, is there a mechanism? I'm an engineer by training, and I love mechanisms. Is there a mechanism? I mean, in your book, you do a great example of describing what happens to the eye when omega-6 goes up and omega-3 goes down, and how it creates a difference in the functionality of the eye. Is there a mechanism that you've come across that could explain a decline in metabolic rate as he describes in that paper?
Yeah, first of all, I'm not convinced that the decline is
significant, meaningful in the clinical sense of the word.
The other thing and this is the major point of the book, is talking about polyunsaturates, because there are 2 different sorts of them. There are omega-3 and omega-6, and that's what I'd like people to use, sort of, rather than grouping them all together. And that's been, in my view, the major problem. So the omega-3, and certainly that's my whole area of looking at membrane composition and metabolism. That's how I came into this. And the omega-3 that are in membranes are not the same as the omega-3 you eat. You eat an 18-carbon omega-3 largely, and you convert it to 20-carbon and 22-carbon long. And this 22-carbon omega-3 I was thinking last night, a good word would be, it's like an energizer for a membrane. It gets incorporated in a membrane and it speeds up processes. And certainly we get correlations between the omega-3 content of a membrane and the activity of what's happening in the membrane and metabolism. But also, so omega-3s and omega-6s are competing for the position in membranes. But for me, let me just say, I think there are 3 things that are important in the obesity epidemic with respect to omega-3 and omega-6. Lots of omega-6 in the diet, small amount of omega-3, lots of omega-6 in your membranes, and particularly one particular sort of omega-6. This omega-6 in the membranes is what goes off to a group of molecules, the prostacyclins, and these prostacyclins turn cells, which are called pre-adipocytes. The language is always confusing to lay people, into adipocytes. And this omega-6, I think, is this conversion of making more adipocytes. When a person loses weight, they don't lose fat cells, or their former name is adipocytes. The fat cells shrink. And a great study done in 2008 showed that they compared an obese group of people with a lean group of people, and the obese people had about, I think it was about 75 billion fat cells in their body. The lean people had about 45 billion fat cells in the body. And this was mainly occurs during childhood. Up until about the age of 18, 20, the fat cells are growing, and they're growing, or they're multiplying, I should say, not growing. They're multiplying at a faster rate in the obese in children than they and adolescents than they are in lean children, such that they get to this different levels. And then during adulthood, they seem to stay about the same. But these fat cells, each fat cell probably has an average lifespan of about 10 years. So there's a continual turnover, but because you've got a bigger mass of fat cells in obese people, and they're producing signals, hormones, which are involved in controlling intake. So these, especially in early childhood, a high omega-6 diet is going to be loading up the child with a greater number of fat cells, and these fat cells will largely be determining food intake and stuff like that. And so even in the Biggest Loser program, where they subjected people to heavy exercise, and they also did dietary change, it was the heavy exercise was the thing, of course, that was featured on television, because eating is not
the dramatic thing.
Yeah, and so people, I think, thought, oh, it's the dramatic exercise that is weight loss. No, it's actually the food changes that cause most of the weight loss. Anyway, these people lost a lot of weight, but a number of years later, they go back to almost the same weight they were before. And that's why people, after going into these crash diets, find they lose weight, but then slowly it comes back unless they're continuing fighting it. And I would say that you'd probably have to fight it for about 10 years to be able to get yourself back to a new set point. Wait until those fat cells die and don't turn over.
Okay, so it is conceivably possible then that if you, quote unquote, fix your diet for a long enough period of time, that your fat cells could reduce down to a lower number as well as a lower size.
Yeah, I would say, yeah, certainly. And
right,
it requires effort. It's not just we're not just a car with a fuel tank. We've got it's the number of cells, which is the important thing in humans.
Because I may have missed it. I don't recall you making that point in your book, and it sounds like a somewhat hopeless problem if you state it without saying that, okay, it may be fixable in the long term. I mean, it sounds like these people, and it's probably includes certainly Brian and ourselves, who grew up in a more obesogenic diet environment than you did. So, I mean, that's an interesting question, because Brian and I both know folks online who have successfully in short term reset their body fat set point, their obesity set point. And no surprise to you, they don't do it by following the advice that's given in the Biggest Loser show. They typically do it by something like going on a ketogenic diet or a carnivore diet. And we know people who've gone from being obese since childhood to lean in a fairly short time, and been able to keep it, I won't say effortlessly, because, it's like an alcoholic. An alcoholic can cure his alcoholism, but only if he stops drinking alcohol. And I think for someone who's overweight, in my opinion, they can cure their obesity, but only if they stop eating the things that have made them overweight in the first place. So
I'd agree with that. Yeah.
Right. So I was a little alarmed when I saw that part in your book, because it does make it sound a bit more hopeless than I think it is. And I'd be interested if we could see, not because, I mean, the people in the Biggest Loser show, they didn't reset their set point. They beat it down with a stick.
Yeah.
right? Through
That's right.
starvation and massive amounts of exercise. And that doesn't work, right?
Exactly.
But both Brian and I have seen in ourselves, as well as in people who are close to us and people online, people resetting that. And when you reset it, it happens fast and you lose weight quickly. And so long as you continue eating that way, it will stay off. And it's not, when I fixed my diet as an experiment, I stopped exercising. Because I was exercising a lot, trying to lose weight, and I never lost a pound. And
that are well fed, satiated, well fed, properly fed.
Yeah, exactly. And it's just when you do it the right way, it's very easy. And so anyway, that's kind of a long tangent here, but I think I'm happy to hear that you think that it is possible to reduce the adipocyte count over time. And sorry.
Yeah. But I bet the first, and certainly it is surprisingly easy for many people once they take charge of their diet, and especially ketogenic diet or carnivore diets, to decrease their body mass. Well, right. What I'd say, probably they haven't decreased the number of fat cells, but they've shrunk their fat cells, and there'll be continually a desire. But these people, once they've had this experience, they normally keep their diet and keep control of their diet, and particularly the sorts of things they're eating. And especially, as I say, this is where the omega-6 come into the thing, because there's also another. This omega-6 in the membranes is called arachidonic acid, but it's a very important source material of lots of other messengers. And one of the other group of messengers is a group called the endocannabinoids.
Yes, please tell us about the endocannabinoids.
Well, first of all, cannabinoids. First of all, when they were interested in how does cannabis have its effects, they went looking and found out that there were receptors for the molecules from cannabis in the body. Well, obviously, those receptors weren't evolved to
smoke pot
and for a chemical from a plant. And then they discovered that there were natural molecules that interacted with these cannabinoid receptors, and hence the word endo, meaning within, cannabinoids. So one of the things that these endocannabinoids, they're involved in lots of things, and we're really only starting to decipher their role in mental health, but also they're involved in appetite. So hence the well-known experience of having the munchies. And so what I would say is that
after one smokes marijuana,
after you've stimulated the system, and so what I would say is too much omega-6 in the diet compared to omega-3, and that's the key point that I try to make in my book. Too much omega-6 in your membranes, and these omega-6 result in elevated endocannabinoids. So I would say also that one of the other factors going on in the obesity epidemic is a mild munchies going on in the population, coming
continuously.
From diet continuously. So increased appetite. And now another aspect. So there are three significant pathways, and we haven't worked out exactly what they are, but there's evidence for all of them. The other one is making fat molecules in your liver. So there are. What most people probably don't realize is that making fat is a very old, making fat molecules is very old evolutionary mechanism, because it's very important for making membranes. And so the first fat you make are saturated fats, and then from saturated fats you make monounsaturates from the saturates. Then you make omega-6 from the, or you don't, but plants do, and make omega-6 from the monounsaturates, and they then make omega-3 from the omega-6. Well, we've lost those enzymes. And it turns out that a high omega-6 diet will, a low omega-3 diet, so a low omega balance of what I would say, stimulates fat production in the liver. And I'd say that this is probably the basic mechanism for fatty liver. But what's happening is the body is somehow sensing deficiency in omega-3. I think it primarily is, and saying we need to make fats called membranes, because we need to make omega-3. But of course, the body doesn't know that it no longer has the enzymes to do that. And so it makes lots of saturated fat and some monounsaturates from that. And so it's that, and that tends to accumulate in the liver, and so I would say that would be the basic dynamic for fatty liver. We make fatty liver for a food. When we feed geese a high corn diet, most people think it's the massive overfeeding of corn, but I would say actually it's the fact that corn's being used, high omega-6, which is the key thing for making foie gras, a delicate
fatty liver, yeah,
expensive food, sort of.
Yeah, you discuss a paper that Ralph Holman wrote, I think back in 1982, about a girl who was put on was it a safflower or a sunflower oil diet, which had
safflower.
Yeah, via total parenteral nutrition, an intravenous feed of oil, and the other things that one needs to live. And she quite quickly came down with an omega-3 deficiency, which was cured, interestingly enough, by a soybean oil infusion. But subsequent research has shown quite clearly that the soybean oil infusion is what leads to fatty liver, because when they replace it with a fish oil infusion, which has hardly any omega-6 and lots of omega-3, the fatty liver is cured.
So the two dominant, in the US, soy is major, but soy does have some omega-3 and has about 12 polyunsaturates omega-3, whereas corn oil has essentially no omega-3. Sunflower oil has essentially no omega-3. So we've tended to group vegetable oils as one category, but in fact, they're all different, and some are better than others, as far as the balance of omega-3 and omega-6 go. So it was a safflower oil, which was the oil in this used to make this intravenous feed that young Shauna Strobel was her name. Unfortunately, there was a gun accident. Her intestines were essentially blown out and removed, and so she had to be fed intravenously from then on. And about a year after being on this intravenous food, which was she had to take that at home, not just in a hospital. She essentially, I would imagine, used up all the omega-3s that were naturally in her body, and they weren't being replaced. So it's an unusual circumstance, but it was the evidence that showed that omega-3s are essential, separate from omega-6s. And that's a key aspect that most people don't realize. They're both called essential fatty acids, and they are both essential, but they can't be converted to one another, and they can't replace each other. So yeah, it was an unusual situation. Most of the conditions that were picked up in her were neurological. I mean, of course, you can't go measuring whether a human's got a fatty liver or not, especially not in that situation. But it was more...
Well, they do. I mean, they use MRI for that now, so it's a lot easier to do.
This was 1978, 1980, when there weren't the techniques to be able to do that then. Yeah.
Right. Interesting. Interesting. And you discuss, as I recall, you discuss in your book some evidence that, I mean, of course, you mentioned the Alfheim 2012 study done by Christopher Ramsden at the NIH, where they found that adding omega-3 to an obesogenic diet high in linoleic acid prevented obesity. So it suggests that if we turn back the clock in our diet and started increasing, and they didn't use a lot, I think it was 2% omega-3 in the diet, that it was able to prevent the onset of obesity in this animal model. And I think that's something that people who are advocating for omega-3, they're missing a key aspect here, is that decline in omega-3 has been associated with this huge, not only imbalance in the endocannabinoid system, but this huge increase in obesity.
Yeah. And so the point I'm trying to make also is that you need to consider omega-3 and omega-6 in relation to each other. You can't look at them separately. And so part of the problem is that the standard lab technique to be able to produce obesity and insulin resistance in the lab, in lab rodents, rats or mice, is to feed them a high-fat diet. But also all these high-fat diets are essentially use vegetable oil. But it depends. If they use flaxseed oil, which is an unusual, or linseed, there's another name for it. If they use flaxseed oil, which is high in omega-3, it's a very unusual vegetable oil, they actually don't get obesity. I remember being at a scientific symposium once where a guy was talking about his work on looking at insulin resistance. And I was talking about, and I asked him what his diet was, and he said, it was a high vegetable oil diet. And I tried to make the point that actually maybe that's what's causing, because if you use flaxseed oil or another high omega-3 oil, there are a couple of them, you don't get obesity and insulin resistance. And his answer was, why would I do that? I wouldn't be able to study obesity if I couldn't produce it. This is part of the problem, is people just aren't thinking, or in the way I think anyway. And so if you feed a high-fat diet with flaxseed oil to a rat, doesn't get obese, doesn't get insulin resistant. In other words, it's the balance between these two types of essential fatty acids. And that's a key thing. That's why I don't like using the word polyunsaturates anymore. I'll talk about omega-3 and omega-6. You almost have to have been brain dead not to have heard of omega-3 as having health consequences, but it's amazing. I may have said this in our earlier talk, how many people haven't heard of omega-6 and quite, educated people. It's just not, it's only the people that are concerned with seed oils, vegetable oils. I prefer to call them vegetable oils, I must admit, because not all seeds are high omega-6. Some seeds are actually high omega-3. Some are between the two.
Well, that's a good question. I'm one of the people I use the term seed oils because the fruit oils, right? I mean, the category vegetable oil includes fruit and seed oils, and we will ignore the coconut because it's some annoying middle ground between the two.
One big seed.
Yeah, coconuts are a pain to fit into that little spectrum. So,
well, I don't say that anyway.
But so the reason we make that distinction is because the fruit oils tend to have a lot less omega-3 and omega-6 fats than seeds do. And they tend
to be monounsaturated. Yeah.
Right. So one of the, you make, I mean, your paper looking at the composition of membranes based on the 4 fats going into the diet is quite interesting. I've seen papers that look at LDL and that look at cardiolipin that show that a reduction in the polyunsaturates can actually reduce the reduce the polyunsaturates in those two membranes. One, of course, is important in heart disease. The other one, the cardiolipin is important in metabolic function. It's the key fat in the mitochondria. Have you looked into that area at all? Am I correct in my observation that a higher monounsaturated fat diet can be beneficial in those two specific areas, even though it won't, say, affect your fat?
We haven't looked into that specifically. I mean, cardiolipin has to have, it doesn't have to, but it seems to have a lot of 18-2 linoleic acid. I tend to use numbers, and I'm talking acids.
Well, again, as you point out in your study, that very much depends on the type of tissue, right? Cardiolipin varies widely from, say, the heart, where linoleic seems to be a preferred fat to the brain, where it seems to be a vigorously avoided fat, if we can put it that way.
Yeah, it also depends very much, and this is part of the problem in the people that come at it purely from a clinical perspective rather than a broad biological perspective.
Right.
For instance, both the omega-3 and the omega-6 that we get in our diet are primarily 18 carbon fatty acids, but we convert them to these longer chain fatty acids, which are the dominant ones in the tissues. And so in humans, people concentrate on omega-3 in the brain, but in rats and mice, the omega-3 in the heart and the muscle and the other tissues are quite high. And that's when people concentrate on human, they tend to say DHA, or this 22 carbon omega-3, but with 6 double bonds, is got a brain function. Well, no, it's got a function right throughout all the tissues. It's just that we keep it high in our brain. I'd say to keep our brain as active as possible, as energetic as possible. And that's the selective pressure for keeping it high in the brain. But you need to look at.
I will just observe, without going into a huge topic, your section on mental health and neurological function. If anyone doubts the importance of the omega balance in the diet, they should just read that one chapter, and they will be appalled at what we've done to ourselves.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that, because in preparation for talking to you, I was expecting a question which you've asked some of the others, scientists. Well, if you had unlimited funds, what would you like to look at in the future?
Yes, great. Please tell us.
So there's two things. So I come from the area of metabolism, obesity, insulin resistance, and I learned a lot in spending the few years research book. And the mental health area I think is just completely untouched, really, as far as this omega balance in the diet is. People are quite happy to accept that if they take a drug, they'll change the chemistry in their brain, but they seem to be very resistant to think that taking the type of molecules in their food will influence their brain function. So my ideal experiment, as I'd have to be an American, would be to try and analyze the tissues of these mass murderers that you have in the States. We have them everywhere, but you particularly have them.
We seem to have a lot of them here, yes.
Well, unfortunately, you have. And as I sort of talk about in the book, I bet, I hypothesize, maybe a better word for a scientist to say rather than bet, that these guys are very deficient in omega-3s and very high in omega-6s. And once that, if you could do a study, and if maybe you do it in prisoners who were in there for violent crimes versus ones that are in there for non-violent crimes, and see a difference. Once people became aware of that, that would just change their understanding of the role of these in diets. So that would be the area that I would think. It would be just fascinating.
Well, you mentioned Joseph Hilbel's paper.
He's
on. He's done some work with feeding long chain omega fats to prisoners. In fact, I think he's currently starting an RCT in an Australian prison right now to see if they can reduce aggressive behavior. I think one of the first experiments, they had a pretty good effect, but of course, as you point out, they're probably not using a whole diet approach. They're probably just saying, okay, let's just shovel some more fish oil on top of a crappy, I would imagine, prison diet without trying to fix the whole diet. I know certainly Hibel knows the importance of the omega balance, as well as anyone else would, aside from yourself.
I found Joe Hibbelin's work quite inspirational. I first became aware of it when I went to an international scientific meeting, and he gave talks, and I sat next to him on the bus going to a dinner. And he's one of my heroes, if you like, scientific heroes. because I think he's done some quite inspirational work. Not well enough known, I think, by people, and as I say, we seem to be resistant to. We seem to be able to treat the brain as a very special tissue that somehow is not a normal. It's just another organ. It's just another. Right. To me, it's certainly in all our work in the rats, it's very tightly regulated as far as membrane composition goes, but it's still influenced by the balance between omega-3s and omega-6s. And another interesting book was one written by, I don't think of his name now, but he's a professor of psychiatry at Cambridge University, and he wrote a book about depression called The Inflamed Mind. That more and more we're finding out that inflammation is neuroinflammation especially is quite important in many of these various diseases,
right.
Sort of, and omega-6 are what the inflammation signals essentially come from omega-6 fat, a particular omega-6 fat in membranes. So I think that's
well, I'll tell you a little anecdote. When I fixed my diet, I think it was in 2010, going into 2011. I noticed a variety of different changes, some quite quickly, all of them beneficial, except for the fact that my hair started to get curly and I got a cowlick, which is kind of annoying, but I guess if that's the worst thing that happened, I can live with that. But I had a bit of a temper at work, and a couple of years later, the guys who I had been working with for more than a decade commented on how much better my temper became after I fixed my diet. And it was really quite embarrassing to realize that. I mean, it was certainly a good thing, and I was pleased that I did it, and they were certainly happy that I had done it too. But the difference in my behavior was significantly noticeable to the people I spent every day with.
Yeah, I'm not surprised at that. And as I say, because many of these, or depression is often associated with many of these chronic diseases.
Right.
And I'd say actually the depression is also another manifestation of this dietary problem. Whereas most people think, oh no, it's not. It's behavioral. If I was obese, I'd be depressed. If I had, rheumatoid arthritis, I'd be depressed. In other words, it's mind-body duality, dichotomy that they use. Well, I say no, actually, possibly these mental health problems, both depression, but also anger, impulse control. I mean, studies have been done. Actually, one fascinating study that I came across was called the Mauritius Child Health Study. I don't know if you remember that in the book, but so Mauritius, they did this a whole variety of studies trying to look at children to see what was causing or what could affect bad behavior later on when they became. And one of the studies is they divided the population up. I think there were about 800 kids altogether. Half of them had they all had a fruit drink. Half of them had omega-3 added to this fruit drink, and half didn't. And the parents, the kids, the research assistants didn't know didn't know who was getting the treatment and who wasn't. But they all knew that the study was looking to see if omega-3 improved behavior. They all knew that was the purpose of this study. And the treatment was for about 6 months. And at the end of the 6 months, they asked the parents of the kids that had the control of the placebo, no omega-3. Well, what do you think your child had? Do you think they had omega-3 or placebo? And as you would expect, about 50% said no. Our child has had omega-3, and 50% said no, they've had the placebo. But when they asked the parents of the kids that had the omega-3, 97% of them said, "Oh, our kids had the omega-3." Sort of 3% said they'd had the placebo. In other words, the parents said, "Well, the child's."
They noticed a significant difference in their kids' behavior.
That's right, but not only that, they also happened, which was quite neat. They also interactions between the adults, and the aggressive interactions between the adults diminished, even though the adults hadn't been given the omega-3. It was a sign that that giving the children the omega-3 lessened their bad behavior, but also made the parents' relationship much better. So it's a whole family effect, even though the kids are the only ones.
A better omega balance is contagious.
Yes, exactly. I thought that was quite neat. And there have been a number of other studies that have sort of looked at that. So yeah, to me, that the mental health aspects of things are the frontier. The only other thing also would be, there's a chapter in the book about the fat one mouse.
Yes.
An
absolutely brilliant idea. Whoever came up with that idea should get, I don't know, maybe a Nobel Prize. I don't know if it's that significant, but it was an absolute. Tell us about the fat one mouse.
So although higher animals can't make omega-3s or omega-6s, a lowly nematode worms called C. elegans, which a lot of work has been done on, still can. These nematode worms eat bacteria essentially, and because bacteria don't make polyunsaturates, there'll be selective pressure for the worm to maintain these enzymes. So these lower animals can make omega-3 and omega-6, so they're not essential in their diet. Anyway, this Jiang, I think his name was, in Harvard, took the enzyme which converts omega-6 to omega-3 out of this C. elegans, this worm, and put them into a mouse strain. So that's the fat one mouse. So fat one mice can make omega-3 from omega-6. So they don't need to have omega-3 in their diet because they can make it. And they have a good omega balance because they've got this enzyme. Anyway, there's a whole suite of things that these fat one mice have been compared to normal mice. And sure enough, it just shows it's another bit of evidence mechanistically that says that the balance between omega-3 and omega-6 is important. But one of the results that hit me most of all was the cancer results. So what they do is they'll take normal mice and the fat one mice and they'll inject cancer cells into them of all different sorts of cancers. And they find that the normal mice develop the cancers, get ill, presumably die. The fat one mice often are able to beat the cancer, and don't suffer the ill health effects. Of course, if we go back, we know from in human experience that we're often developing cancers in our body, but they're being fought back by the immune system. We found that out with HIV. I mean, the way HIV was picked up was all these unusual cancers starting to appear in certain populations,
right,
and stuff like that. So that's evidence. And so the HIV was attacking the immune system, especially the killer cells, and so therefore the cancers were increasing over time. So to me, that's another area which I think is really open, that a really high omega-3, low omega-6 diet would be beneficial in fighting cancer.
And it's, sorry, Brian, go ahead. Were you saying?
I had some, once we're through this topic, I just have some questions.
Yeah, so just one point to make on this. I mean, and when it's just slipped my head, so it seems, I mean, it's almost counterintuitive because we talk about how omega-6s are inflammatory, and of course that's not an absolute statement, and that how omega-3s have this resolution of inflammation function. But I mean, from a number of the examples that you give in your book, including cancer, and I think it was sepsis, having a proper balance seems to allow the immune system to work better and to clear infections better, and then to heal the body much more effectively than if you're in a high omega-6, low omega-3 environment, as we all are.
I have no idea what the mechanisms are. I think we've yet to discover that, but you're right. So often in talking, especially people that have followed up omega-6s say, yeah, they lead to all these free radicals. And so you would expect that omega-3s would do the same thing and make possibly be even worse because they've got more double bonds in them. But it doesn't seem to work like that. And I think the reason being is that what omega-3s do, and this is, so as I say, in this 18-carbon linoleic acid as the omega-6 in the diet, but the major fatty acid in membranes, and this is where I think membranes are really important to look at, is this 20-carbon, 4 double bonds arachidonic acid.
Right.
So there's, and that shows, in our rat experiment, that showed the greatest variation. It wasn't in the rat's diet. They didn't get it, so they have to be making it and putting it into their membranes. But it showed the greatest variation of almost all the fatty acids in membranes. And this variation was affected by the balance between 3s and 6s. So one of the things that omega-3s are doing is they're diminishing the amount of omega-6 in this membrane. And one of the things that omega-6s are doing is they're diminishing the omega-3. It's the competition between the two is going into membranes. And this arachidonic acid produces over 100 different types of signaling molecules, and so that would be where I would think that the actions are taking place. Don't know whether that answered your question, but I forgot what your question
No,
was.
it's, well, the key part is we don't know exactly how this is happening, but it does seem to be happening. And it's, luckily, the fix seems to be pretty straightforward. So you don't need to wait for 30 years of lab research to just address your diet. Brian, what were your questions?
So in the FAT1 mouse that was given the enzyme, so the machinery capable of producing omega-3, what was the result? What was the balance that pressure produced?
FAT1 mice and normal mice, if you feed them a diet which has no omega-3 in it, only omega-6, the normal mice have very low levels of omega-3 in their membranes. They can't make it. The FAT1 mice have normal amounts.
What kind of number are you looking at? Like percentage?
Is it 50% omega-3? Is it 1% in the FAT1 mice?
It varies according to, I've just got the book here. Look,
Oh, wonderful.
There's a figure in there. Omega. I stole the title of the chapter from John Steinbeck. So, of mice. So
I love that, by the way. Yeah.
So you can see the top row are the normal mice. So both, and the bottom row is the FAT1 mouse. Both groups have been fed an omega-3 deficient diet. So they've only got omega-6 in their diet. And you can see that it, the dark part of the circle is the omega-3. So you can see it varies the tissue.
It varies by organ. Those are different organs down on the bottom row, right?
Okay.
There's brain, heart, liver, kidney, muscle, and also milk even. So so you can see that especially the brain. So you see the top row, there's hardly any omega-3 in the tissues except for the brain. The brain is being selectively.
Okay, so the body, because we started this podcast talking about one of the main points of the book is that the body regulates how much PUFA, and then the body also, it'll reflect our diet. But you say that does vary per organ system, but it's proportional to what we are eating. So for instance, the brain will have higher concentrations.
So, and it depends upon the species. So in humans, the brain has a lot of omega-3. People will say, "Oh, fish, omega-3, great brain food," and I'd say, "Yeah, actually, another great brain food is brain." Which is, when I was growing up, we were fed offal, and brain was a couple of ones. But in fact, if I'm trying to get across the fundamentals of nutrition to people, say at a party or something, I'll have this particular introductory thing. I say, actually, the lessons of nutrition are quite simple. Everything I need to make up my body is found, and then I'll leave a pause to get attention, in your body. Sort of. No, I'm not proposing that, cannibalism. All I'm saying is you just need to think simply about evolution. Where animals are that group of bacteria that ate other bacteria. You know, that's a simple. We're descended from that group of bacteria. That's what we do, and
Right.
over the period of time, we've lost the ability to make certain molecules, omega-3 and omega-6 both. But that just means that we have to get them preformed in our diet because we can no longer make them, and that's I think an essential understanding of what an essential nutrient is.
So another question I would ask is, you know, a lot of folks that follow Tucker and I, you know, they might ask us often, like, what is an ideal, like, what can they do? What can they do? What can they test? And what is an ideal ratio? What is an ideal balance? What's an ideal percentage? And how to do that? Is it RBC membrane? Is that a good reflection? Is that something that someone can follow along? Is it whole blood? You know, what kind of
he's
is
talking
that
about,
you've ever tested yourself for humans that are curious? You know, I'm
Well,
not
I've
looking
done-
for a definitive answer, but at least shine some light on you know,
So-
how helpful is it to get lab work done?
It's expensive, and one of the things I'd like to see done is develop a simple test to be able to measure it. So I'd recount two experiments that I did on myself to try and convince myself and convince other people. One is I took, so this was an experiment where I had a high omega-6 diet for a fortnight, then a high omega-3 diet, then I went back to a high omega-6. And because I had a lab, I could measure fatty acids. And the first one, I had a gore swab, and each morning I would rinse my mouth out with distilled water and then wipe it very strongly to get the cells. I would like to see a cheek mucosal test, just as we take this for, well, say these mass murderers, we do their DNA. I would love to be able for us to be able to measure omega balance of cheek mucosal cells. And I think I've spoken to some people in the technical field about how I think you could do this very cheaply. And the other one I did was when I was looking at insulin resistance, I did a glucose tolerance test on myself, where I, once again, after 2 weeks, I took a high omega-6 diet, high omega-3 diet, and then went back, and I took blood glucose measurements after drinking a certain amount of glucose, and in that I kept the excess blood from my finger pricks and analysed it. But I could do that because I have a lab. I had a lab. I don't have a lab anymore. It's quite expensive to get it done. You can get it done in Western Australian pathology firms, but it's quite expensive.
So can you summarize the glucose experiment that you did on yourself? Because I think that's huge.
Yeah. So glucose tolerance is, which is often done, you drink fasting, you normally do it in the morning or without having eaten in the previous 12 hours. You take a set amount of glucose and then you measure your blood glucose over time. And your blood glucose goes up and then it goes down as the glucose leaves your bloodstream. So the blood glucose goes up, you secrete insulin. Insulin acts largely on your muscle and fat cells to make them take up more glucose, and your blood glucose goes down. So the rate at which that drops is going to be indicative of whether of the glucose going into your muscle and fat cells, and essentially stimulated by insulin. So if you're insulin resistant, your blood glucose will go up and will stay up and even go a bit higher. If you're normal insulin sensitive, it will go down. And so on the omega-6, my blood glucose came down at a certain rate. On my omega-3 diet, it came down at twice the rate. And when I went back to the omega-6 diet, it came down at a slower rate. So that's...
So the omega balance was essentially making you diabetic. The poor omega balance was making...
A low omega balance was making me type 2 diabetic, insulin resistant, or I was more insulin resistant on the so a lower omega balance. I mean, that's one of the chapters also in the book is the explanation of insulin resistance, which is really a better description of what type 2 diabetes is.
Right, exactly.
Is it's a bad word. I mean, we have these words left over from history, but there are at least 2 different types of sugar diabetes, and they're quite different.
Right.
But just talk about diabetes. So what I would say is, I don't think you need to measure your blood. I mean, as long as you take a whole of diet approach. So at the end of the book, I have a number of recommendations which are
This is what I wanted to ask you. You have your personal rules.
I'll just make sure I'm pretty sure I've got them. Eat lots of green leaf material. I eat a massive amount of green leaf material now, and also I grow it, and I find that a pleasure, growing in the garden, or even I'm about to move into an apartment in a couple of years' time, but I'll still grow green leaf material, or buy it, of course. Avoid deep fried foods. I avoid them, like the plague. Luckily in Australia, our dairy food is pasture fed. It comes from pasture fed cattle. In the US, that's not the case. The standard dairy will come from grain fed animals. So I avoid grain fed meats. I'll eat seafood, and in Australia, I tend to eat lamb. I avoid chicken and pork because they're grain fed in Australia as they are in the US. I'll eat them if somebody gives them to me, but I'll never order them in a restaurant, and I'll never buy them anymore. I'll eat beef sometimes, but even in Australia, some of the beef is being what they call grain finished. So if I ever buy a canned fish, sardines, tuna, never buy in oil, because it's not in tuna oil, it's in vegetable oil. So the key thing is to avoid vegetable oils. Also avoid, of course, ultra processed foods, overwhelmingly. That's where a lot of the omega-6 is coming in the diet, and minimize snacks. I'm not perfect, but I try and keep those. I think that's it. But concentrate on avoiding vegetable oils as much as I can. If I do use vegetable oils, I use canola oil. Canola oil has the same omega balance roughly as grass-fed dairy.
Although it has a lot more omega-6 and omega-3 than grass-fed dairy would. The balance is the same.
Yes, it has, but so that's where I'm not concerned at all with the total amounts of these things. I'm concerned with the balance and just trying to maximize the balance. I tend to not. So sometimes I turn excess green leaf material into pestos of various sorts. And in doing that, you need to use an oil, and I tend to use canola in that. So always trying to play the game. An ideal balance, I just try and make it 50-50. In a paleo diet, from what we can gather, it was about that. In the case of Inuits, Eskimos, as they used to be called, it was more 70% omega-3, 30% omega-6.
Now you mentioned in your personal rules, bread most commonly is soy and linseed.
Yeah. So when unfortunately I do like bread and toast, and so what I do is there's a particular brand of bread which has soy, which is 12% omega-3, 88% omega-6, and then linseed, which is the same as flaxseed, which is about 75% omega-3, 25%.
So it's an omega-3 enriched bread.
It's got linseed in it, which is an omega-3 seed. So I don't know what the total balance is, but just always, if I've got a choice, trying to choose avoiding vegetable oils, but if I'm going to use seeds, try and choose them. And I've thought of using more flaxseed. So one of the people also that was influential in the book is Susan
Allport,
who wrote a book, The Queen of Fats. And so she's gone into essentially business of making these big flaxseed cookies.
Is she Australian?
No, she's American. So,
okay.
Yes, yeah. And she's so she was the one that introduced me to some of the stuff, and was also another inspiration.
And she wrote a very nice blurb for your book, I noticed.
Yeah, she did. And she also, in her original book, she had contacted us, one of my colleagues, Paul Else, and I, interested in our work and what it had to do with metabolic rate, and omega-3s. So she became aware of that work very early on.
Yeah, she did I came across her N=1 experiment, and I'll link to that. And one of the things that she did notice when she increased the linoleic acid in her diet was a decline in her metabolic rate. Not a huge one, but I think her explanation was that it would be enough to result in the sort of weight gain that the average person sees over the course of their life in a modern diet environment.
That's she contacted us all way back in the early 2000s about that, and was thinking, and I thought that was a possibility, but I'm not convinced now. It's the other three mechanisms I think that are the omega-6 increase in making fat cells,
Right.
the 6 increase in endocannabinoids and enhanced appetite, the munchies, and the omega-6 enhanced conversion of carbohydrate to fat, which I spoke about earlier.
Right. Okay.
But she, yeah.
Brian, I really appreciate the amount of time that you've spent with us.
Thank you. I appreciate it too.
It's been an honor. We both really enjoyed and I think got a lot out of your book. And as somebody who's been studying this intensively for, since 2011 now, any book that I can read that I get a lot out of is a very happy surprise to me. So it's an excellent book. I couldn't recommend it any more highly. I thought it was wonderful, very well written. Your editor, I mean, I don't know how much your editor gets credit. They always get some credit, but I mean, it was just really it was a pleasure to read and very well presented.
Well, I have to also compliment Tucker and being an autodidact of bringing yourself up to, quite complicated stuff and educating yourself about all this. You have a lot of understanding, it seems to me, of this area.
Well, thank you. I was a self-taught engineer, and unlike most people, the first thing that I fixed in fixing my diet was taking out the seed oils, for not any particular good reason, but then I saw all these immediate changes and I became, I guess, obsessed is the word, to figure out exactly why doing the reverse of what the dietary guidelines tells us to do had such manifest and manifold beneficial effects on my health, and realizing that it could, benefit my family, my colleagues, and, I mean, it's not too far to say that this is maybe the biggest health issue on the planet.
And relatively unknown. I mean, there's an emerging awareness, and also the low carb community, the keto diet sort of community are starting to become aware of it also. So much so that they're to change their name from low carb keto diet groups to sort of metabolic health groups. That's so I think there's a ground, and to me, there's a ground up revolution happening against the medical establishment dogma of this, saturated fat is evil, the whole message that was permeated in the 50s and 60s and 70s.
Yeah, Brian's website is titled The Seed Oil Rebellion.
Well, I agree. I think it's I think there's a ground up revolution hopefully happening. Hopefully it continues and more people become aware of it.
If we have anything to do with it.
Yep.
We're working.
Well, Tony, thank you so much again. It was really a pleasure. And hopefully, as Brian said, we could probably do 10 more of these podcasts going through many of the chapters in your book. I don't know if it would be fair to subject you to that. That's how enthusiastic we were about this book. Thank you very much.
Thank you, also. Cheers.